Again in studio, this time about different forms of symbols, also in Old York Bank. Of course, there my bank is more like a safe, and inside the safe are millions of books. Not easy because me is author of all of those forums, but also the author of different brands in Old York. To understand all York, it's not simple when it's sunny, but when it's rainy, of course, you are also thinking about 25 years ago in different forms of symmetry together with different forms of modeling, but also not easy to understand all the forums. Also, up and down symbols are slightly strange, especially if you think about love from the left and the right side of the photography. Not easy to understand all forums in Old York because are extremely difficult when it comes to medicine. Usually, all the doctors want to be verified, but that is actually not possible because in Old York it's a lot of noise and a lot of problems in 90% of the time you are spending in Old York. Me with book and money, minimum 20 million book, but not more or less, because anything else might be a 100% disaster if spending more time in Old York. To understand that, of course, there are some prohibitions for Old York, especially in elegant circle, or of course, if you are messing together with my films or trying to steal them. Of course, every film could be worth around $1 million, but of course, if that is not deposited to my bank, which of course is 50% of charity for Old York also, and not for any other city. Of course, we have a bigger problem. To understand different forms of people that are pretty is not easy, but some of those might be actually quite prohibited if they are mentioning any forms of different forms with me up and down with different forms of the philosophy of design. In Old York, everything in book is extremely political, but of course also not easy to understand alternative occult medicine, which is of course mentioned in literacy. To understand the millions of prohibitions, also for the astronauts, but also different forms of disease, is also not simple. To understand pseudoscience of the bank, it's of course some sort of knowledge and not very related to extreme science of other nations. To understand the different forms of the factors in Old York, it's not easy, but also to understand the faith that people have in book or authors. The entire community actually follows the authors. And from the point of theory, we should have around 50 million followers also on social media from that point of Old York, which is, of course, extreme duty for some leaders to provide me that. Of course, that is a theory and research is still going on. The science, it's not easy, but also what you provide in science, also the pseudomedicine might not be very, very difficult, or sometimes also difficult if there is evolution. To understand different forms of the navigation, it's astrology, but also gastronomy together with book, or the simple PR of 1 million. Different forms of numbers around Old York are extremely difficult, and there are different forms of ideas. What different forms of the pseudoscience together with the numbers means. Of course, there is also some sort of astrology with book, but also some form of alchemy. To understand acupuncture, it's also not easy for the perfect body. And of course, that's where also that 25 years ago the symmetry comes in. The science and life, of course, it's not easy. And it's not easy to understand simple forms in TCM, but also, of course, different forms of the face, together with different forms of simple Taoism. To understand the systems in All York is actually quite easy together with applications if you are outer. But if you are not, probably there in Old York, you are going to become extremely unsymmetrical and probably also religious or even confused about any forms of science or any forms of medicine because city is extremely difficult, very difficult to understand different forms of astronomy in all York, but of course also in America. Together, also slightly related to London, but also with the golden age of the books in 15th century. To understand the scientific revolution in 15th century is actually not easy, but also to understand or compare that with anything more new that 15th century might be a 100% disaster. To understand different forms of licensing in Old York, it might be much easier than you think if you are building a simple book. But if you are building anything more formed together with will, of course, that might mean another disaster. To understand simple forms of 1 million book made with no author, but with a lot of worker, because on the end, the author do not gain anything, but actually all the all York gains your product, whatever the product is. Different forms of 17th century, it's also not easy to explain, especially also thinking about different forms of astronomers. Of course, astronomers in 17th century are not very advanced, but from some other point, if you look on everything, they are actually much more advanced than modern one. Modern one are actually extremely difficult, especially with all the forms of science or what type of pills the medicine or health should be making. To understand different forms of symmetry, it's not easy, but it's also not easy to understand multiple accounts that come together with different forms of the buildings if you are an author in metalworking of Old York. To understand different forms of the hallways library in Old York, it's not easy, but also to understand the book called Death, it's not easy because actually me also sometimes make strange book title, not easy to understand myself. But from thinking 25 years ago, an observatory of that, also it's not easy how 25 years ago everything was in my portfolios and in research. To verify that type of problem, it's also not easy, especially if you lack any form of the knowledge. To understand different forms of the gold, it's not easy in Old York because usually you are not going to find any gold in my apartment unless you already seen my book and purchase it. Then of course you might see there are tons of gold. Usually the products, tables and desks not made from wood but actually from gold. And very difficult to know the author, especially in Old York, without common sense of any forums of modern times. In 17th century anything could happen with very difficult people. To understand different forms of people together with different metals is not easy, but also different forms of strength together with different forms of world are extremely difficult. Of course gold it's not the most important, but there is also the copper and also aluminum. The nickel and zinc are also important, but also silicon if you are more in circuits. Of course, in all York, there is more thousands of stores that are offering high quality circuits, but also different forms of ledgers. So for authors, actually, they should actually purchase few ledgers or few ledgers more if you have more book. Of course, if you do not have them, and if you are not author, then probably you should think about simple investing in aluminum or gold. To understand symbols, it's not easy, and some symbols could even be extremely chemical in English. And of course, it's not easy when you think about oxygen and air, but different forms that might be in book in air, that's extremely difficult. To understand different forms of the posts in media are extremely confused, especially because they are mixed with technology and extreme disvalued uh, art of anything form of what is not science. Also, to understand different forms of gold strategy, it's not easy, especially if you think also about how that would affect the aviation or different forms of construction, because usually 98% construction in Old York, but strangely also in other city, usually buildings are not made from gold. They are more like art. So it's very difficult to think about buildings if you are industrial artist or even designer. To think about the different forms of salts, it's also not easy when it comes to different forms of engineering, but also engineers are actually quite difficult in the United States usually. uh, Different forms of the Carnage together with others are not simple, but also to understand Latin forms might be very, very important if you think about more royal society. To understand the philosophy behind different forms of the name is actually very, very difficult, but also very difficult to understand society in America because they are just quick English speaking people and they do not understand anything more than simple English when it comes to 80% of Americans. To understand different forms of the society, it's not easy, but also how much chemicalia is in American society, especially because there is not enough good doctors in alternative medicine. The United States of America are extremely difficult, and there are thousands of different organizations, and of course, also some very rare books that are describing Washington, but also the trouble there, and sometimes there are also disasters. To understand what should be done in Washington, it's not easy, and probably you should look for more book and not only one, because one usually it's just not competitive to that form of problem. To understand different forms of problems in society, it's not easy. But also 90% of people in world are not purchasing gold. So that's also the problem of poverty or what people think about more educated reality. People just think that people are having good cars and good houses, but royal people sometimes also invest in flats, usually not for themselves, but royal people actually are going to share those flats to others. Of course, the pricing are different forms of programs together with different forms of social duties that people have online or in other form of information, but also to understand the society together with community on the media, it's not easy. The science in book it's also not easy and extremely environmental in America. To think about the work in America, of course, it's not easy, and you should think about a thousand more company in gold industry. Of course, owners might disagree with me, but if me own few company more, building more gold designs and gold function store, that's not problem for me. Of course, me would have a lot of problems with research and methods and how to integrate gold in 5% of most poor in America. And that's, of course, not simple. To think about technology is some sort of nonsense, especially in America, because the technology is simply too biomechanical and too chemical to think about. From the point of theory, it's not easy to build a solid service in America, but also not easy to understand any form of the methods together with the book. To investigate better theory, it's also not easy, but also from the point of sound, how to provide safety and how to provide a better graduation for those that are 13 today. It's not easy. To understand simple forms of life, it's not easy when you think about society, but also how to build a better science. To build a better science, it's not easy, especially if you are going to educate people about different forms of materials. Of course, usually the materials come along with a bigger success, and a lot of problems come because people do not know materials well enough. To understand different forms of the simple fonts that are actually providing every day the open sphere for different forms of education is also not easy, especially if me work in charity 365 if it's book. And of course, Old York might be the biggest problem, and there is a lot of really a lot of poverty because only 1% of society is royal, but the other 95% of all York or more are extremely low index. To understand different forms of the factors, it's not easy, but also the effect, the science or web, it's not easy. And probably the science is actually for the people that have private labs. Those are extremely secured with millions of security guards, but also very, very dangerous if any worker come in because that's some sort of the research, but also the integration of the funds and high level outdoor platforms. Not easy to build different forms of dynamics if you think about anything together with the soft form of index, but also not easy to build another level if you are simple forms of the outer. There is millions of critics about me in all York, but also to have some quality in book, it's not easy because usually people think about standard values. To understand different forms of digital publications, it's also not easy, and of course, we have millions of doubts about that. Usually, things on the net are extremely mean, but also evil, and there is even possibility of extreme abuse of human if you are looking too much in any forms of the publications on the internet. Of course, it's much different if some people release everything, but there is a question: are they paid? To be careful more about self payments is usually the most important to continue with science also, and also to build a better life, because if you do not build a better life, the science and all forms of entire web have no meaning at all. To understand different forms of the face is also not simple, but usually in my category that is farming, farm. Not easy to understand those forms also. Of course, in America there is millions of different forms of science research about paper also, but those are all empty and usually for high level outdoor extremely available for 1 million book or 1 million product. To understand different forms of the index, it's not easy, but also to understand different forms of the metrics on the web, it's not easy, especially with users and how they follow the author. To understand different forms of available author, it's not easy because those are usually not available and they are more in skin sectors. The providing better skin for users, it's not easy, especially if you think about any form of like in my book. Actually found as name Fike. The Fike is extremely strange. And of course, also some form of the California figure. To understand different forms of casual forms, that people are usually buying but also see are very, very difficult. To understand different forms of the concert is also very difficult, but those are probably too specific topics to think about in this film. To understand different forms of simple technology, it's not easy, especially if you think about different forms of the metro in Old York. The metro in Old York are extremely, extremely, extremely dangerous sometimes. But of course, if you are a security guard, they are extremely safe. Safety, of course, in Old York, usually also a problem. To understand better designers around America, it's not easy, but also to build a better design for self, but also to share it to some point so others can actually build a better design. The design are actually things that are used by all known people and all the artists actually, but also the entire industry of basically everything. Designs are simple forms, but also the production of those designs might cost millions of dollars and is extremely complex if you do not involve some graphics together with different forms of specifications for more poor class, but also for much richer classes. To understand different forms of the costume, it's not easy when it comes to more poor book or extremely rich book, but it's also very difficult to understand the costume if you are playing a police. To understand different forms of the game design together with police is extremely difficult, especially in Old York. But also to understand actually, if you are an author, it's just art police. So that's actually some sort of jewelry for author. The interaction design is very difficult when it comes to gaming, but also the farming together with Old York, any form of art industry to understand different forms of the landscape, but also to understand there how to purchase different forms of lands is extremely difficult, especially in Old York and around. There are millions of different logos that can actually build in this world. But of course, from the point if this world is Africa, of course it's very hard to think about very advanced logos. And of course, those logos for Africa should be extremely, extremely simple. Or, of course, they might have different forms of the meanings, not to include any bad design like Europeans usually make. Think about the systems in Europe is extremely difficult because there is more than 15 language. And from that point, Old York for me is more appropriate, especially for English design. To understand yourself sometimes it's also important, but also the design usually affects the architecture, especially if you are building abstractions. The abstractions on some point can become reality, but also to understand engineers that are actually working together with different forms of design. Of course, the accounting is very, very difficult, but also to understand different forms of specification together with design, it's not easy. In Seattle, of course, there are also a lot of coders and a lot of designers, but me is an author, and the Seattle would be only a story, but nothing more. Probably more political considerations and simple software, but not more than that. Probably some simple picture if you think from form of out and in form of designer. And of course, interior designers are more difficult than those that are around the streets. To understand different forms of the designs in New York, it's extremely psychological. And to understand different forms of situations that could actually happen in Old York. Around Old York is actually 90% better to invest in different forms of banks because there is not so much models. And 90% of people do not think about that. Also, if you are thinking about the author from the science point of meaning, of course you must start with the number 1 million for making books. If you are going for any lower, probably you are artist. For me also prohibited to be artist and probably more training in designer sector until reaching a million, 2 million, 5 million, or 50 million, some sort of theater, how the book is made. To understand different forms of the designers that work with me, it's not easy, but also not easy to build a better construction together with the English design. There are different forms of the stage machinery, but of course, also different forms of the films together with Old York. Featuring film is extremely difficult, and of course, it's already featured here. But this sound is extremely, extremely difficult, especially if you involve any form of scenery together with the net. It might be half a fiction but also half reality design, sometimes like in any film. And of course, if the film have purpose educational or any other, of course it can evolve in better design. The theory of films are not easy and how the films are made, but also how to understand sound and use it later, but also sometimes to use it right away for a better scenery. To understand all York in me, that would be more year 2000, but usually me more 17th century book together with other grocery of artists. To understand different forms of the theater together with different forms of the face is also not simple. To understand interfaces together with three-dimensional surface is extremely difficult, but also to understand different forms of the scenery that might be in different forms of the opera flats. Of course, that's more complex because my self-theorem, if this is 100% silence, if any form of interior. To be specialized, it's very important. If you are not specialized, you might make a lot more mistake. You will need to actually fix them later. To understand different forms of the stock scenery in book is actually together with the street scenery, and that's the most difficult sector. Also the sectors of the production of clothings. It's extremely difficult to understand different forms of the platforms together with scenery of the wagons in the tutu locomotive. Also transporting all my books around the world to understand different forms of meanings, together with all those lacks in word and pretty people, but also to understand different curtains, but also different forms of the rooms that can appear in a book. Of course, theater of the backstage is also not simple, but there are millions of different terminology also for the stage up and down, and also what is still safe. To understand simple placing around the UK and England, it's also not easy, but also everything in this film also explains how hard is to understand higher level of morals, but also materials, or how hard is actually to build a better system or more safe system. To understand more safety is sometimes not easy, and what sometimes actually each human have different valuation but also what they think about safety. So if you are thinking about safety, everything is very unsafe unless there is a lot of symmetry in life. With symmetry, everything become more possible. With symmetry, everything is not anymore theater. Also, the symmetry become more and more logical if you are living more simple. And simple in all York, it's extremely difficult.